Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar on navigating India's coal transition, a macro view organized by the International Institute for Sustainable Development and Center for Development and Environmental Policy, Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. I extend a warm welcome to all of you joining us from various corners of the globe. My name is Deepak Sharma, and I'm a policy analyst with ISD's energy program based in India. IISD is an independent think tank with offices across the world. We have been operating in India for more than a decade. IISD works on issues of energy and sustainable development. We have been tracking government support to various energy technologies and support the national and state government in their effort to shift support from fossil fuels to clean energy in a just and socially responsible way. Now let's shift our focus to today's topic, navigating India's coal transition, a macro view. The topic is both timely and relevant, considering the role of coal in Indian economy. I would like to announce a few housekeeping rules before I hand over today's webinar to our moderator. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on IISD's official YouTube channel. The link to the channel will be provided in the chat box. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with colleagues. We also invite your comments and questions. Please look at the chat in the Q&A box on your screen. Please enter your comments in the chat box. If you think you have a question for the panelist at any point, just type it in the Q&A box and our moderator will pick these up. In case your question is addressed to a specific panelist, please specify that as well. I'm now going to hand over to the moderator of the webinar, Dr. Runa Sarkar, professor at IIM Calcutta, to start the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepak, and very, very warm welcome to all of you participants. Deepak has set the tone for our discussions today, and I'm really, really glad to have all of you here on behalf of the Center for Development and Environment Policy, IIM Calcutta, and very specifically, the Building Roadmaps for Industrial Decarbonization and Greening Economy, or BRIDGE for short, initiative. We are very glad that we are now starting the first of a series of 4 webinars to bring you the salient outcomes of a year-long endeavor of around 57 researchers and policy practitioners from varied disciplines in economics, finance, political science, environmental studies, and climate change. And together we have produced an edited volume titled The Role of Coal in a Sustainable Energy Mix for India, a Wide-Angle View. Now, this volume is to be published by Routledge in September. It is going to be an open access volume for everyone. And the ideas, the findings have a very clear policy orientation, and we hope the findings would inform policymakers in the government, as well as decision makers in the corporate work world. The primary objective of this edited book is to formulate a research agenda for developing pathways towards transition to low carbon for industry and create a knowledge support systems to enable just transitions. Therefore, the theme of climate justice actually runs through the book, through all its sections and chapters. Most of the contributors in this volume, or most of the contributions in this volume, are actually the collaborative effort of 2 or more institutions, demonstrating, therefore, the specialized yet interdisciplinary nature of both the issue at hand, energy transition, and also the nature of the contributors themselves. We will put up, yes, so thank you. Deepak has already put up the link to the book. So if any of you are interested to know further, you know where to go. Now, this webinar is centered around the lessons from the very first section of the book, which is a macroeconomic analysis of the multiple pathways towards a sustainable energy mix for India. We have employed a cross-cutting approach to weave together occasionally divergent lines of specialized thought into a tapestry that demystifies the challenges of and approaches towards moving to a more sustainable energy mix for India. We take stock of the current knowledge and identify research paths and research gaps. Now, just to demonstrate the interdisciplinary nature, this first section has 6 chapters and 5 boxed items, and they represent contributions from 25 authors from 15 national and international institutions. Therefore, it became a real challenge for us to identify just 4 panelists for this webinar. And I'm really happy to be able to see the 4 speakers for this particular panel. And I must say they are a great choice, although I'm very grateful to the remaining contributors who would have been equally good for the discussions. Just a quick overview of what the section contains before we actually move to the webinar. After an analytical assessment of India's energy needs and the availability of extant coal to address it, the challenges of the trilemma of energy access, affordability, and security faced by India and its impact on transition choices are addressed. After this, the role of the center versus the state in initiating and enabling the transition, its macroeconomic impacts, and specifically social costs of the same are explored. Finally, the state of play with respect to deep electrification as a complementary strategy to be implemented alongside the movement away from fossil fuel-based energy concludes the first section. Now, for today, we will discuss India's energy needs and the challenges it faces to balance growth with decarbonization and its macroeconomic impacts. We will leave it to you to explore the state of play with respect to deep electrification in the open access book as we go forward. Before I have the pleasure of introducing my panelists for today's webinar, just to share with you that we will have a discussion for around 50 minutes among ourselves. And followed by that, we will have a discussion with the rest of you who have joined this webinar. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will address those questions as we move forward deeper into the webinar. I hope there aren't, I hope you're able to cover all questions here, but this is a largish audience. So if there are other questions that we are not able to address, please do put them in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and we will come back to you with our answers after the webinar. All right, so with this, I have the pleasure of introducing my panelists. I will do this in reverse order, and therefore, even before I introduce the panelists, let me introduce the person who's going to close the webinar for today, Professor Mrityunjoy Mohanty. He is my co-editor, a member of the Center for Development of Environment and Policy, which I coordinate, and a member of the economics faculty at IIM Calcutta, which I am also a part of. Outside of universities and business schools in India, he has taught and lectured in Mexico and Canada, and he comes to the transition discourse from the lens of growth and structural change. Today, he will weave the discussion together with his concluding remarks at the end of the webinar. We have here Dr. Vigyas Sharma, a senior research fellow at the Center for Social Responsibility in Mining, Sustainable Minerals Institute, the University of Queensland in Australia. She is a co-author for the 5th chapter of this section. In her current role, she is leading the center's work on fossil fuel transitions, particularly looking at the social, political, and economic impacts of large-scale coal transitions in several geographies, including India, China, and Australia. Thank you for joining us despite the different time zone, Vigya. We have Mr. Tirthankar Mandal, who has explored the alignment of policy with decision in the context of energy transitions. Now, Tirthankar has nearly 15 years of experience working in the interface of energy, development, and climate change. His interest lies in the evolution of institutional relationships between different entities of federal government and state governments, as well as the changing role of public finance in the context of climate change activism and high renewable energy scenarios. He represents WRI here today. Dr. Sambit Basu, thank you for joining. He is the Director of Programs and Chief Energy Economist for Power Foundation of India. He has co-authored the chapter on India's energy trilemma. He has over 25 years of experience as an energy policy and regulatory economist. And we are very glad that he's been able to make time for this webinar and for the excellent chapter that he has contributed. Finally, we have Mr. Sunil Dahiya, an analyst with CREA, the Center for Research for Energy and Clean Air, leading its work in South Asia. Now, Sunil will clear our vision beyond black coal and hazy skies on India's coal and coal-fueled power plants. He has over 11 years of experience working for nonprofits on diverse issues. His experience is research, policy support, coalition development on the issues of energy transition, climate change, air pollution, and community rights, which is demonstrated because he is the co-author of the first chapter of the volume, which is a collaborative effort of representatives from CREA, EMBA, and IIM Lucknow. And there is a boxed item from our hosts, IISD. Now, at this point, it's important to remind you that all views expressed in the discussion are personal. They may not be attributed to the institutions that the individuals are affiliated with. So please do keep that in mind as we go ahead. Again, reminding you the Q&A box exists. So as we have our discussion, we request our participants to also participate, through their questions and ideas through the discussion boxes for us to go forward. Over to Sunil now. Sunil, we've set the expectations for you already. You need to clear the skies. So can you help us understand the exact demand supply scenario with respect to coal-fired power generation in India? Can you tell us what the real picture is, please?
Thanks, Runa. I'll just take a minute and share my screen.
There's always some situations which one can really see only through a picture. And therefore, I believe Sunil's presentation will help us understand the true picture of India's energy scenario.
Sorry, it took a bit of time. Thanks, Runa. Thanks for a wonderful introduction. And I'm really happy that I'm the first speaker starting this discussion about a very, very comprehensive book, which just doesn't talk about the technical aspects, but also about social aspects and many other cross-cutting questions which we have to answer before or while we move on the energy transition pathway. As you mentioned, it's a very complex path to walk, and the clarity will only come while we are working on this and at the same time thinking back about what we have done and how should we move ahead. Coming to the question of electricity demand over last couple of decades in India, how has that unfolded, what has that resulted into, and how do we foresee that electricity demand growing in future? It's something which we have been tracking over last few years, and it's just not us. The government does it fairly regularly, at least right now. Before that, there was a bit of issue with the with governments. We want when should they update it, how reliable is the last assessment, and how should we approach it. When I mentioned that, I particularly points to this graph where I have looked at, or the authors in this paper have looked at different government projections of electricity demand scenarios which were put out by the Indian government or Central Electricity Authority over last few years. We had 18th electric power survey, which was around 2015-16. And if you look at the blue line, that's the line which they projected that India's electricity demand would be in the following years after the electric power survey was put out. And we see that's the single line which is above everything else. The revision to that was done in 2018 based on base year data of 2016-17 in EPS 19, and that led to downgrading of the electricity demand scenarios and showed about 20% higher projections in the earlier scenario. Obviously, the time period between the two assessments done was about 5 years. And that's why we see a divergent gap widening between the two projections, which again, because it was done on base year 16-17, when we came to 17-18 or before the pandemic, even 18-19, we saw a diverging pathway of actual electricity demand compared to the projections, and that led to the light turquoise line also diverting away from the actual demand in India. After that, you see a dip in the actual electricity demand for India, and that was primarily because of the COVID, which rebounded. If you look at the growth projections before COVID, we were growing at about 4.9% CAGR. And during COVID, it decreased and then increased to 1% in the year after COVID. And we also saw a high jump of 8% post-pandemic, which shows in the red line. So why I talked about this is the trend of the projections of electricity demand by the government itself shows that there were some issues which were not being resolved by the government in those surveys. And every time when we moved away from the projections in the following 2 to 3 years, there was a divergent path of actual demand compared to the projections. And that has definitely led to a lot of stranded assets, both in power generation sector, and we might see them in the coal mining sector, but we'll talk about them later. And now there is a latest electric power survey report which has come out, which is the 20th electric power survey. And according to that, there are certain scenarios wherein you see these two lines going up till 2041-42. One is the 20th electric power survey normal scenario. The other one is a bit moderate scenario where the demand doesn't grow as much as it grows in the normal scenario, and the RE is also the energy efficiency also kicks in a bit more aggressively than others. Now, all these scenarios show that the electricity demand has always been over projected in each of the projections by the government. When we look at other think tanks, not just KIA, but many others, including IEA, World Energy Outlook, PAYAS, which is an Indian think tank. All those think tanks also says that the demand projections by the government are very optimistic, and we might not reach those demand numbers. And that's why you see these other lines till 2030, all of them are under the 20th electric power survey report. So what we want to say is that in India right now, the government projects that will be needing about 2200 terawatt hours of electricity by 2030, whereas all other scenarios and even the government's moderate versus normal scenario puts this in the range of 1920 terawatt hours to about 2100 terawatt hours. And that's the range where electricity demand can be. Right now, we stand at around 1500. And that means that there is about 700 terawatt hours of increased demand, which we have to meet through different sources. Now, I don't know whether we should dive into where that electricity will come from right now, or that will follow. But if we have a minute, I can talk a little bit about how that electricity will come from different sources. So as can I continue for a minute?
Sure, Sunil.
Thanks. So as I mentioned, that there will be this requirement of under different growth scenarios of 4.5% to 6%. I mentioned that 4.9% CAGR was the growth rate over last decade. CA projects 6.1% growth rate, whereas all other think tanks present a growth rate of 4.5 to 5.8%. That's why we have these four scenarios in our chapter. And in the most high growth scenario, India might need 2,200 odd terawatt of electricity. We know that we have commitments to install renewable energy, we have nuclear, we have hydro, and a little bit of gas. So what we did in this scenario is we said that if all those numbers stays consistent or constant across different scenarios, and we assume that at least the government will install or that amount of electricity generation capacity, or they already have that, and that doesn't change, how will coal requirement change in these different scenarios? And we came out with these numbers, wherein the overall coal requirement, this is not just power generation, it also includes coal requirement for other sectors. Later on when I'll come to that. But in terms of electricity requirement, electricity generated from coal would range between 1,000 terawatt hours or million units to 1,273 million units. Looking at the specific coal consumption, 1 unit of electricity consumes 650 grams of coal right now. And that's a number which has been decreasing over last decade. And what we did in our study was we assumed that stays constant, and then depending on those scenarios, the amount of coal which will be required for electricity generation will be around 850 million ton. Added to that, about 350 million ton of coal for other sectors, including steel and cement, would take us to around 1,150 to 1,200 million tons of coal requirement for India across all different sectors, including electricity generation. And we all have heard of NCLT tribunal hearing cases on the different power plants which were stressed, or which had no off-takers, which doesn't have PPAs, which doesn't have coal supply. And these are the power plants which led to huge loss to India. There are a couple of examples where a 4,000 crore power plant might be sold at 400 crores of scrap value. And that's a loss for a country like India. Now that existence of stranded assets in the power generation sector might extend to the coal mining sector, because as I mentioned, the overall coal requirement in 2030 would be around 1,250 million tons, whereas as of March 2022, India had about 2,200 million ton of mineable capacity allocated to different players in the mining sector, of which Coal India was the highest, but the captive and state PSUs on blocks are also increasing over last some time. And when we know that the demand is going to be saturated, and if there is this 2,200 million ton capacity which is given to these miners, one of the two scenarios will happen. One, they destroy all the forest, livelihood, and wildlife under those forest patches to mine this coal and start these mines. But because there will not be enhanced demand for coal, if these new mines want to sell coal, or they are able to sell coal, that would have to eat into this Coal India's share, and then already destroyed areas where Coal India has operational mines will be left stranded. Or if Coal India continues to supply coal to these to these power plants and to these end use sectors, then these new mines will never either take off, or even if they take off, they will just destroy the land and will not function economically to be able to get, because there is no increased demand. So that's
Thank you,
a
Sunil.
broader overview I had, but if there are specific questions, I can definitely add more on. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sunil. Yes, so that's interesting that that perhaps the demand for energy is somewhat, or electricity is somewhat over projected, and perhaps we have the mining capacity we need. So maybe you have cleared the skies for some, but I think you've actually muddied the skies for many others. I think there's more confusion now. But Sambit, in this situation, can we now ask you to weigh in with your thoughts about whether things are actually as clear? I mean, how has this shift to clean energy in the last decade affected India's emission intensity, India's self-reliance? And given this impact, how exactly should we navigate India's coal transitions? What are the challenges that we face?
Yeah, thanks, Runa, for inviting me to join this esteemed panel to share my views and thoughts on this very important and contemporary topic. And why it is so interesting is that the way that I see is that the future, the way that it's evolving, does not necessarily reflect the past. The reason why I'm saying so is that let's look at things in while Sunil has helped us chart out the kind of how energy is seen to be evolving in the Indian context, and how planners are putting ahead in terms of demand numbers, supply numbers, and these are indicative to my mind. There's no right and wrong, because it's all depends on the model that you use, the assumptions that you take, and as we have seen that studies could be dime a dozen. So the point that I will try to kind of explain right now is that how India has been and what are the challenges in front of us. How India has been, we have seen that India's GDP has grown over the past decade, if not more, probably since not just decade, probably 3 decades. If you see, since 1990, the seminal changes that happened, on an average, you will see that 6% has been the GDP growth historically. But what has been so notable is that the development that India has seen in the past decade in terms of the energy mix. We globally, there is a climate awareness and shift and pressure which is evolving, which has built up, and India has been at the forefront as a climate warrior in terms of defining targets for itself, commitments, whether it's in COP26, whether it's the nationally determined contributions submitted to the UN. We have seen that we are right at the front. There is a global trend which is going on in terms of a decarbonization trajectory, and India is also part of that in terms of being there, demonstrating the changes and contributions that they can do. If we see historically the GDP, if we talk about the numbers, before that, you will see that India has done fairly well in terms of emission intensity, has done fairly well in terms of energy intensity. But if we see that, as we all know, that the emission is really a product of population, affluence, which is basically per capita income, energy intensity, which is the energy required for GDP to grow, and emissions to GDP, which is emission intensity. It's a product, it's a combination of these. And it's the interplay of these that is going to decide what my emissions are. Historically, we have done fairly well in terms of emission intensity, energy intensity. But if we go down a little bit and see the GDP composition, India, right from shifted from agriculture, jumped to the services driven growth. And that has actually helped in value addition in terms of the denominators to the numerators. So you will see that energy consumption requirement was much less, but the contribution to GDP was much, much more higher. But if we see that, and that helped in terms of keeping our emissions low, that has helped us in terms of contributing to energy intensity, keeping it down. But we still were low in terms of our emission, our consumption of electricity per capita consumption, all this kind of stuff. Now let's come to a situation where going forward, can we continue to do this? Can we continue to play this role? On the one hand, we are talking about a population. We have become a populous country, which is the largest populous country, which are right now, I think it's about 1.428 or something like that billion, the population, which we have surpassed the China, which is also very close in terms of 1.425 billion. What is interesting is that in this, we are still very low in terms of per capita consumption. One. Two, so there's an enormous amount of energy poverty which is there, despite electricity reaching every single household in terms of access. But do we really are able to provide the electricity? Are we able to provide the basic amenities to all the people at large? That is one. Second is that if you see the size, the composition of the population, the State of the World Population Report very recently come out, and the numbers over there, if you see, you will see that the age group of 15 to 64 years has in India 68% of the population. What is more interesting is that the 10 to 24 years population has 26%. Now, this is the young population, which we are talking about could be a dividend, but could be a disaster if we cannot provide the social kind of thing to them. So we are talking about that. We are talking about access to energy. We're talking about all these kind of things which we require. We have aspirations to grow from where we are today to $3.75 trillion in economy to some 26 trillion dollar economy. That's aspirational at the 2047 when India is going to be 100 years of independence. So that's the kind of aspirations we are talking about. That aspiration cannot happen overnight. That requires urbanization, growth, employment, all this kind of stuff which is going to build up. So there is one aspect to that. So access. We have seen how an unfortunate disruptive event like the Russia-Ukraine war has created enormous amount of globally awareness in terms of security driving everything. And we have seen our own chief economic advisor coming up in the open and talking about that, look, we can't afford to compromise our energy security. Everybody's talking about energy security. So on one hand, we're talking about renewable energy, which has grown, which has set ourselves target. On the other hand, we're talking about energy security. And while having said that, the difficulty is balancing access, security with the sustainability and environment. That's the trilemma we are talking about. Because we have chased targets for ourselves in terms of adding to 500 gigawatts of renewable energy, or in terms of whether historically we have grown at, say, in the past decade, our RE has grown 128%, and solar has grown 25 times. Can we sustain that kind? We have, for the past, we have added probably in the past decade 10 gigawatts of solar every year. Can we continue to do that and say that we'll add 30, 40 gigawatts going forward? I mean, so that's the kind of, and which requires some $25 billion annually. So we are talking about numbers over here. We're talking about a complex situation over here. We have another complexity, which is kind of, which is very important, which is basically that our dependence, because of the abundance, affordability, and locked-in technologies and deep socio-economic connect that we have with the coal sector, can we so easily shift out of the coal sector so easily without disrupting the requirements? So what we are talking about over here is a very, very complex, nuanced transition along the decarbonization trajectory. And what we are not one saying that we don't need to be sustainable. We don't need to grow being clean energy. We're not saying that. What we're saying is that what we do over the next 10 years is very critical. So while we can keep on talking about maybe we move towards a clean trajectory, we move towards a sustainable trajectory, which obviously we are the most vulnerable in terms of climate things. Today, Biporjoy, who is impacted so much? Why are we so worried? We are worried because our livelihood depends on so many other things. So we are climate warriors. We will continue to do that. But having said that, we have to plan things very well. Probably the 10 years next is extremely critical. And my sense is that we cannot so easily move away from coal, and there's no denial of that. So the question is how best we can move along this trajectory, keeping our coal together, balancing the thrust we are putting on the renewables, and ensure that we don't, in some sense, compromise the sustainability without compromising additionally the access, affordability, and security of the country. So that's the context that I'm talking about. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sambit. Indeed, you've brought to perspective how complex this whole process of transition is, and that it's not going to be easy to shift away from coal the way it's not just a textbook shift that we are talking of. There are realities involved. India as a federal state has a way of working. States have a role to play. The center has a role to play. Different regions are getting affected differently. You talked of Biparjoy. Of course, it's going to wreak havoc in Gujarat. You are having people being, evacuated, cyclone shelters created, and so on. At the same time, Biparjoy is also having an effect on the rest of the country because of the delay in monsoon it's causing. So almost any impact to the country has differential impacts across different states. And in this context, Tirthankar, what would the macroeconomic implications of decarbonizing India's energy sector be? You've looked a little more in detail at that. And, would this impact actually be uniform? And if it is different, how does that affect the central policies, state policies, and the tussles between them? If you could shed some light on these issues, please.
I actually take the cue where Dr. Basu actually concluded, and it was a very good starting point for me. Just to, because it was the questions, the kind of platform set for me is on the terms of macroeconomics. I just point out two numbers, which I thought is in the just to set the context, is that whatever we are talking about, what is that we are talking about is about this decarbonization thing, and it's driven by more and more capacity addition of the renewable energies, right? And if we look at the government expenditure on the renewable energies, particularly from the federal state, for the last 10 years or so, the central government has been spending around in the range of, from the central budget, of course, its spending is around 2.5, 2.7 to 2.3. It's gradually been in that range. It's hovering around 2.2 to 2.3, that range. It hasn't touched 3%, but it has been around. And for that, it has actually grown from almost sub 10 gigawatt to now almost like we have crossed like 100 gigawatts of renewable energy, whatever you call it, like everything put together outside of the large hydro, we have actually touched more than 100 gigawatts of capacity addition. To put in the context, the petroleum and natural gas as of last year is actually 26% higher than the renewable energy sector, the allocation, right? And most of it is going to the subsidies because of all reasons we know, because of the rising oil prices, gas prices, all of those things put together. But this actually is, we know in macroeconomics, what does it mean for, like, what does this 2.2% of the 2.3, whatever percentage is it, what does it mean really in terms of macroeconomics? It is actually crowding in more and more public investments. I am not for a moment saying that it doesn't make any sense from this much of investment. It does make sense for this much of investment, because more and that has been clear from the capacity addition. But the fact of the matter is that this investment is going to only 8 or 9 RE rich states, and that is where the difference or the the change, the difference in the investments and differences between the states actually incoming. And that is where I actually take the diverge from my numbers and all of those things to actually talk about the later half of the questions about what are the difference between the states and the centers and all of those things, and even within the states. As Dr. Basu was referring to, this transition is going to be much more complex. And yes, it is going to be much more complex. And one of the reasons why it is going to be complex is that for a longest period of the time, and even now, we are in a policy framework which is more or less guided by some of the basic assumptions which hold good for our fossil fuel-led policy framework. Be it in terms of, so the energy sector is, so first of all, in the context of energy or electricity sector or power sector, it is a concurrent subject. So both state and center has equal right to make policy making, but in some cases, states has a overarching right than the center. So for example, tariff making and getting land for renewable energy and land for power sector, basic lands, land availability, that comes under the purview of the state, so on and so forth. So that is where states overplay the center, and for some other reasons where center needs to give the direction, that is where the center has its play and gives the oversight for the states. That's the clear understanding between the states and the center, and that has been the case since the independence. Now the complexity arises when we see that for a largest period of time, the fossil fuel-led policy making is being incorporated in the renewable energy sector. I give you just one example, which is where this tariff policies, right? So we all know that the way procurement has been done, we arrive at largely at an average pricing for the discoms, and then discoms pass it on to the consumers, and then for different types of consumers, agriculture and residentials are subsidized, and their subsidy has been taken off by the commercial and industrial consumer. That's precisely the way it operates. I'm not saying we need to diverge or we need to give away that socialistic social welfare kind of mechanism, but we can actually operate within being in the RE sector, because we never has seen a scenario where the prices for fossil fuel actually has fallen to 2 rupees or 3 rupees. Even now, the fossil fuel for generation cost of fossil fuel per unit is hovering around 3 to 4 rupees per unit. But solar generation has been around the range of 1 to 9 rupees grid connected. But I'm not talking about storage included, but just the grid connected part of it. So those kind of anomalies are there, and we haven't been able to incorporate the benefits of that. So if we incorporate those benefits, that needs to be, the reforms needs to kick in, and that is where I think the policymakers needs to be nimble enough, and they need to work around those kind of issues. And that is where the decision makers need to be bold enough, and decision makers need to be forthcoming in actually taking risks, I would say, rather than taking decisions always based on risk, right? So you need to take informed risk in the decisions in the days of renewable energy. So unless and until you take that, you will be locked in. Dr. Basu was referring to locked in of the technology. I would actually say locked in of the policy dynamics as well. So fossil fuel comes in with the locking in of policy dynamics, and that is where we might not be heading towards. We need to take the benefits of these things. And then the pricing part of it. Basically, there is no reason why we should not be given a reduced amount. I know I'm shooting over the time, but I just finish it in another half a minute. But the thing is that, well, agriculture subsidies, whether to be given or not, that's a big question. But I would say that yes, agriculture, that needs to be dealt with both from the methodology perspective as well as what needs to be priced at and at what level. So those kind of methodological issues needs to be clarified, because of the reason that we are getting the input side of the story has changed, and we need to consider that as well. I stop over here and happy to answer those others.
Thank you so much, Tirthankar. Vigya, so Tirthankar has actually summarized a lot and talked about now not just the technology lock-in, but literally the econo-socio-technology systems lock-in. But where does the common man or common woman fit into this picture? What are the social costs, if you will, of transition? What are the social implications of decarbonizing India's energy sector? Why should we even consider the social costs?
Thanks, Runa. And I have to say that it's an advantage coming last on the panel, because everybody before me has said some really interesting conversations, and I don't have to do the hard work of presenting my own ideas. I can just build on them, build on what they've said. So I noted that Sambit and Tirthankar have both brought on issues of energy poverty, global geopolitics, and the policy frameworks, which are fossil fuel industry orientated in India. And I think amidst all of it, transition is inherently has a very social, deeply social character. We've discussed already how significant and almost critical India's energy transition is globally, but we also know that India has significant development aspirations, so it's thriving on this reliable, affordable, secure energy supply, the energy trilemma that I think it was Sambit who mentioned. There is also, just globally, there's also very poor historical precedence of decoupling GDP from emissions intensity. So if you've got to develop and move up the economic ladder, it has been historically energy intensive, the whole process. So India has followed suit. India has had a huge dependence on coal and has been fossil fuel driven in that sense. But India's coal sector is just so interesting because it is deeply complex, and it's the scale that India has in its coal landscape is not seen anywhere else. Perhaps China, but we don't know enough of China. We don't know much of the informal sector, if there is any in China. But across the full value chain, just to give you a sense of how, the scale that we're talking about here, including the downstream users, over 10 million people in India depend on coal. It's the single largest contributor to our industrial activity, but also, it runs Indian railways and it runs India's power generation. So there's a huge multi-layered level of dependence on coal. There are also coal as a resource, it's very localized. So, the eastern and somewhat central India is deeply dependent on coal. This is also the states which have historically not had a high human development index. So, they've not had, despite industrialization, for example, in Orissa and some other parts of the eastern India, we haven't necessarily seen economic development at the scale translating into positive social outcomes for public goods and service delivery. States have historically been also dependent on coal to provide public goods and services, which have otherwise or ideally should be state responsibilities. The whole, the dependence on coal, workers working in the coal sector, who are often low-skilled, migrants from other regions, already situated at or below the poverty line, all just adds to the complexity on how much dependence there is on coal. There is also this issue of, the local costs being borne if as and when India begins to transition out of coal gradually, and where is the line drawn between local consequences and local costs for a global good. So we have seen in many parts of the world where this has kind of stirred community sentiments around, what is the cost for us, whether it's environmental pollution or conflict, but what are the local costs of acting and taking decisions for a wider global good. And we have seen in other parts that this has created political and institutional roadblocks to closure. So I think from a social sense, the coal landscape in India is very interesting, but very, very complex. So I think, and for those reasons, it's important that we bring in the social and institutional elements when we talk about decarbonization. We haven't done that holistically in India yet. And as I said, India has had a really kind of a not so great pattern of bringing in communities on the ground in its decision-making process. And we know from experience that those communities which are, communities that are going to be at the most risk of disadvantage from a green policy shift, if it's done in a technocratic way and without consultation and critical reflections on human rights and such, is going to be really problematic long term for India to manage this low carbon shift. So I think social costs are integral to how India packages its transition and plans for this transition. We need adequate public support and policy support and social protection, but I don't think India has done that well enough just yet. And there are pockets of research coming out, which are promising, but I think India has got a long way to go in how it embeds social thinking in the way it plans its transition pathways forward. I don't know if it helps.
Yes, no, thank you, Vigya. You're right. It is complicated, and we do have a long way to go, and therefore the need for such discussions to build on this. I do see a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'll request the audience to continue putting in your questions there. I'll take the privilege as moderator to go through one round of questions with my panelists and then take up questions from the Q&A box. So please go ahead and put in your questions there. But just taking off from where Vigya left off, Sambit, do you want to share with us your thoughts on how a strategy for just energy transition can address some of the challenges and balance the use of coal and fossil fuels with clean energy technologies? And whether, the Prime Minister's LIFE initiative actually fits anywhere into this, just transition strategies?
Yeah, so it's so as we discussed, it's obviously very, very complex. And as I said right now, right when I was speaking, that I think the next 10 years, 15 years is very critical, because just to take off where I left. So what we see is that the future, because we have a large population, we have the trilemma. There is a need that employment needs to be generated for people to not only improve their livelihood, but also people to kind of have a decent life, dignity of life. So all of these requires growth to be now, historically, if we see that services sector don't have such a huge employment, so you need more blue collar jobs to kind of be created. So one is that you need to have a lot of that probably industrial growth, and we are talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now, the moment we talk about industrial growth, manufacturing, all of these to kind of pick up, now these cannot be picked up. Many of these will require are hard to abate sectors. So that's one. Second is, we're talking about urbanization. We have seen in the past couple of years that our transportation, our roads and highways have been kind of increased tremendously, which has helped us. We are leaders in South. A recent Economist article also talks about how India has been doing phenomenally well and globally. Why India is demanding such a huge respect. Why US today is kind of doles over our Prime Minister visiting over there, and everybody kind of talks about, because India is there. We are there right at the top in terms of kind of creating so much of kind of thing. So the point is, you can't sustain all of that without having a real thrust of energy, and that cannot come from just renewables. Okay, that is one. Second is that we need to kind of also recognize that while we have grown in terms of the clean energy, but there is always a question which has been time and again raised, that how clean is clean energy? Whether it's in terms of, because if we look at material intensity, there's a trade-off. Yeah, I mean, there are studies which have already looked into it. There's a trade-off between energy intensity, emission intensity, and material intensity. So on the one hand, your emission intensity comes down, but your material intensity may be going up tremendously. So there are studies which have actually looked into it and shown that whether it's a solar, whether it's a wind, whether it's all these kind of renewable energies, they're highly material intensive. And even if you want to go towards storage or EVs, electric vehicles, so even there, the material intensity is tremendously high. The moment you talk about, and when I say material intensity high, 1 terawatt hour of electricity coming from conventional and coming from clean energy has a magnitude of, I'm talking about material intensity of 200 to 300 times. So it's a very large, and surprisingly, I mean, India doesn't have those resources. I mean, we don't have the resources, we don't have the processing, but on the other hand, we're talking about building up enormous amount of kind of manufacturing in these areas. So let us be real in terms of how much we can do. But on the other hand, we are also kind of changing our narrative now. We are moving more and more towards, okay, we need to do more with terms of nuclear, maybe small module reactors. You will see that there's so much discussion now happening that NTPC is collaborating. We have read all of this reading in the newspaper. It's no longer that we are going for that way. But the question is, do we really have those are potentials, but do we have the manpower to man a nuclear plant? Okay, do we have the capability?
So I'm going to now direct exactly those kind of questions to Sunil.
Yeah.
So Sunil, I think Sambit's made some very, very valid points on, questioning, well, is clean energy clean, and so on. And, let me move to the person who understands technology better than I do. So Sunil, go over to you.
Thanks,
How do you respond to that?
Thanks, Amit. I think that's the beauty of this book, that multiple people having divergent view coming from different backgrounds have come together and put those thoughts together so that the reader can have a balanced and a neutral view in terms of what's happening in different sectors. I would just like to point to two aspects of what Sambit was speaking, maybe in a bit different line. One is that yes, every technology we build doesn't have the enough resources at least available to manufacture or expand that technology right when it starts to grow. That has happened everywhere. That happens in all the sectors. And also, if we look at the material requirement for coal, it's not just coal burning in power plants. There is whole supply chain and instrumentation, manufacturing, as well as technology and material to support that which is required from transportation, mining, building of a power plant and other things. So there is material requirement in all these technology sources. For renewable, we right now doesn't have the kind of resources available which we might need to cater to the increasing demand, but they'll grow when we walk that path, and we have seen that over last 5 to 7 years. The second issue is when we talk about that India, I don't know whether that's the implication when we talk about employment in the coal sector, and we say that coal sector is one sector along with manufacturing and others, which has huge employment potential. I think manufacturing definitely does, and that's where I think most of the increased coal demand is going to come from the manufacturing or the industrial output perspective, not from the domestic consumption of electricity, because that can be sustained with the increased ambition of renewable energy if we are able to install that. But what's happening in the coal sector is over last 1 decade, if you look at how the coal mining is changing, we are seeing more and more mechanization, more and more isolation of the mining mines from the local communities. And now when the private sector is also entering this business in a big way. We also will see that the kind of informal businesses or income or livelihood which the communities had around Coal India mines or the government mines, where they were able to access some of those coal resources and channelize them into the local economy and make a livelihood out of it. That space is shrinking. As I mentioned earlier, that because of the mechanization, a mine which required 500 people now might need just 10 to 15 people to operate, because there is huge machinery which is coming up. And that's why my perspective is that doesn't matter we go for energy transition or not. We have seen it in the last 10 years. The coal consumption has increased, whereas the jobs in the coal sector have decreased by the rate of 5 to 6% right now. It will increase further. Job loss is going to happen in any situation, whether RE expands or doesn't expand. And that's an argument which I think all of us in the energy sector should stop using, where we say that there are more jobs with more coal. That's not the case. It's changing, and it has changed in past.
Indeed. Thank you, Sunil. Tirthankar, this is where I think I'd like you to weigh in on the fact that coal is not mined in every state. And you don't have coal-fired power plants in every state. And in exactly the same way, the sun does not shine equally brightly in every state, or each state doesn't have a coast where they can harness wind power or a free enough land to be able to harness renewable energy. So in that context, what are your thoughts on transition policies? How do we align the center and the state and ensure that as a country, we are able to have, as we mentioned, a sustainable energy mix, keeping in mind access, keeping in mind affordability, but at the same time, recognizing that we don't have a choice but to reduce our carbon intensity?
Yeah, I think I would actually talk about 3 points over here. One is, first one is the general kind of, it's not a disclaimer, but it's a recognition of the fact that despite all the differences and differences between the states, among the states, and between center and the states, the political direction is well acknowledged, right? The direction of energy transition is that we all talk about net zero, right? Or we all talk about clean energy transition, because of the fact that the moment the Prime Minister went ahead and declared about the 5 object elements of net zero and whatever the energy transition. I don't call it Panchamrit because I don't remember the 5 elements, but post that, at least 4 or 5 states had actually gone ahead and declared about their own net zero targets, which are more ambitious than the 2070 targets. So there lies the beauty of the federalism in India. I would actually start off from there. It's not about more the more we actually talk about these differences, the more we actually see that there are overarching alignments. The issues actually come to the foray or surfaces when we actually talk about in terms of when it becomes prescriptive. I think some of the policies of the central of late has become in the nature of prescriptives in terms of accounting measures. It's not more from the policy side of it or directional side of it or strategic side of it. So energy transition has 2 aspects to it. One is the strategic side, where there is an alignment across the states and the center, whereby every states actually talk about going green, going clean energy and all. And by the way, I just want to point out one thing which has come out in the CEA's latest report, which actually talks about between 2026, between now and 2030, the India's coal capacity addition is actually falling in terms of overall energy mix. So it is actually falling from the scale of 50 to 39%. And if you actually go to 2030, it will actually fall down to 29%. This is the capacity addition. I'm not talking about the generation units. So there is a catch in that. But in all probable cases, it means that the rate of addition of coal capacities is lower than the rate of addition of renewable energy capacities. That's a major, that is where, and it is not done by the center alone. It is all done by the states and the center jointly. So that has to be kept in mind. That is why I mentioned at this point of time. That's a very important point which I bring in, because, you know, having said this point, the point of inflection happens when the center or for various reasons becomes prescriptive. For example, through the recent amendments, when it becomes prescriptive in terms of creating centralized authorities, or becomes prescriptive in terms of creating, like, diluting the authorities of ACRCs and various other bodies, which actually talks about truncating the powers of the ACRC, state regulators, to determine the tariff rates and all, in the name of bettering the financial health. I do agree that the states have gone ahead in terms of populism and all, and there needs to be some kind of stick somebody has to come do in one way or the other. But prescription doesn't work in a federalism. You have to devise innovative ways to come out and deal with that. Doing prescriptive things might not actually be the best solution to do that. That's my first point. And the second point is that, so that is the 2 points I have talked about. And the third and the last point is that about the ecosystem level activities that we need to talk about in terms of the reforms that needs to happen. Because as I was talking about, that most of these states, we actually can divide all these states into 3 categories. One is energy, one which are rich in resources and can go for these new technologies. The other ones who sits in the middle. And the third one who are basically neither here or not there. They are the basic net consumers of all of these things. So, but we have seen that for the overarching direction, all sets of countries, all sets of states are actually setting themselves up for EV targets, setting themselves up for solar targets, and all of this. So we have to demarcate, and some point of time, we means the community that we are talking over here are actually have a major share of our work needs to engage with the state governments particularly, and say that, hey, you are in a different platform than Karnataka. If we are talking to Jharkhand, and say that, right, you play to your strength rather than follow all the Karnataka and Gujarats of the India, and say that you do what the others are doing. There are enough of opportunities that can be reaped in terms of tariff reforms, in terms of going for innovative modes of PPAs. And innovative tariff reform doesn't mean that you need to bring a hell lot of do away with the existing tariffs. You build in the time of use tariffs for the residential sector as well. Every cities or every states has the cream of the residential sector who are basically benefiting from the subsidies of the residential sector. We need to actually target them as well. So I just giving you an example, but I end over here.
Yeah, we'll end it, because there's lots and lots of questions that the audience has. And I thought I'll just take one which is broad and for all of us, which says, may I invite comments of the panel on energy disparity in India and how energy transition or continuance of coal aiming to address it in a systemic manner. So essentially, the participant wants us to continue our debate, and I'll just open it up, therefore, to all of you to just give us your thoughts, a minute each, because we are kind of running out of time. So starting with Sambit maybe, and then the rest of you can give us your thoughts on this energy disparity and how energy transition will address that in a systemic manner.
Yeah, so it's a very tough question, but disparity is known and existing because it is first is that, but just picking up on what I think Vigya as well as Tirthankar spoken about. If you look at the coal, where does it rest? One is that it rests in 6 states predominantly, and it cuts across several districts, hundreds of districts in those few states, and it's basically focused mainly around some of them. But if you remember this, many years back, there was a freight equalization policy. And because of the freight equalization policy, the levels of industrialization that happened actually brought about inequalities in the way that the various states developed. And that's one of the reasons that you will typically find that the level of development that happened in some of the states which have, that's a resource curse, you may say, that the states which have the resources have not developed as much as the states which have not developed. Okay, so that's one of the things. People thought that, okay, by bringing in maybe renewable will bring about more parity in terms of creating more, but unfortunately that is again an issue which continues to be there. In terms of, see, there are 2 points that I want to one is that the way that I want to make it very clear that we are on a path towards sustainable energy. There is no doubt about it. And just picking up from where Tirthankar pointed out that the states are also going much more aggressive. But also, we have to recognize one important factor is that states are sometimes over aspirational. So sometimes we confuse potential between potential and what is achievable. Okay. So once we talk about them, the typical example would be the new economic policy. The new energy plan, electricity plan, about whatever. So if you see the CEA's report, we are talking about adding substantial renewable over the next till 10 years. Okay, so we are talking about adding substantial over there. But the question is that a few of them is that we have conflicting things. One is that we just have do not have adequate infrastructure to kind of add to that. Second is that we are making things much more expensive for them to kind of, so there are issues around whether we can add 30 to 40 gigawatts of solar capacity every year. We are saying that we need to add 300 gigawatts. Do we have that? Can we bring $25 billion every year? So these are the kind of questions that we have. Also, the global prices are going up. And even if we increase our capacity, so while we have the production linked incentives for the manufacturing within the country, but you see, there is no control that they will necessarily have to sell to the domestic. So there is a huge demand in the US, which now they don't want to buy from the China. So a lot of the exports, if you look at the exports, it has increased from India tremendously in terms of panels. So if you see that the global market becomes the price setter from what it is being. So it is not necessarily what you domestically produce is actually becoming much more cheaper to supply, because then the market internationally becomes the price setter. Okay, so that's the price that you set. So that is one. Second is whatever it may be actually standard, I mean, through a competitive bidding, whatever discovered price it might be, it's actually going up. It's no longer coming down so easily. And also that's not the kind of, that's at the generation end, right? But you still need to deliver at the user end. So probably you need to add 3 or 4 rupees per unit. So it becomes 2 rupees becomes 6 rupees per unit in terms of the thing. So those are the kind of complexity of the issues. And in terms of energy disparity, our focus, unlike China, is more ground-mounted, grid-connected renewables. We have not focused on decentralized. We have not created local solutions. That is something probably will create more kind of employment, livelihood creation. So in the thing. So while we need to look at, you also mentioned about life, we also need to look at many kind of solutions which could be clubbed under separate buckets and having all guns blazing. It is not just one particular solution which we may be looking at. So maybe short term we need solutions, medium term we need solutions, long term we need solutions. Okay, and we need mutually exclusive but collectively exhaustive solutions in some sense. So on the one hand, you may have energy efficient, so it's basically high efficiency, low emission solutions, which could be on the demand as well as the supply side, which could be a combination of the coal as well as renewables. okay, depending on where we are. It could also mean that the private sector can continue to kind of focus more on providing solutions. The government can be focusing more on policies, on R&D. Our R&D is phenomenally low. We have continued to be at 0.7% of the GDP, and it has never been out of that. So unless until we can bring ourselves out of that, that is the thing. The other is in terms of probably your demand management, energy efficiency. A lot of that needs to be kind of done. That it is very difficult to use prices to kind of influence people to do the shifting and consumption reduction in some sense. So in some sense, you need to kind of encourage people to do that. And you can't do that. You can't ask people to pay more unless and until you provide better quality of supply to them. So there are issues around it. And then there are other aspects, which is basically a more circular economy where we need to move towards. So I'm not saying that we can find the silver bullet. It's a buckshot. It's buckshot of many things that we need to look at. And that's the way that we can do it. But having said that, I know it sounds pretty, but you need to focus more on like not just 70 years, not just 50 years, not just 40 years targets. We need to look at in short slots, short term, medium term, long term, connected to each other. So it is not just about one versus the other. It's all of these together. Because if all of us have to grow and grow in a sustainable manner, we can't belittle any of these solutions.
Thank you, Sambit. So Sambit's addressed not only this question, but also possibly the question which is, related to energy poverty. So he's kind of touched upon those issues. Hari and Damayanti have both talked about the role of that government could play in accelerating clean energy investments, and whether there is a distinction between the central and the state government contributions in those issues. So keeping that question in mind, can I just ask Sunil, Tirthankar and Vigya in that order to just give me your concluding comments, keeping in mind this particular question. So starting with you, Sunil.
Thanks, Rana. No, that's a very valid observation that while the government has been doing wonderfully well in terms of coming up with RE targets and NDC commitments and other things, but when we look at the investment, as it's mentioned in the Q&A session, that it's mostly the private and then the states coming up, whereas, okay, so the short answer is yes, the central government as well as the state governments can do a bit more than what they are doing in terms of actual RE deployments. And why I say so is because as it's evident from all the discussions we are having, which are basically sourcing from what the government has been doing over the last decade, wherein it signals both ways that we are moving on the RE pathway, but we are not able to ditch coal. And that's the reason for dilemma. And that's not just in terms of policy, but also in terms of financing. If we look at PFC, which and NTPC, NHPCs, and all the public sector companies, which have started obviously investing in renewable energy a little bit, but most of their investments are still going to coal sector. And a very typical example of this dilemma, or this confusion which the government policies are causing, that we all know Delhi air pollution is known to the world. Everybody talks about it, and we all know it. One of the primary reasons for air pollution is fossil fuel consumption, and all the fossil fuel consumption should technically reduce or have efficient controls in Delhi NCR region at least. And that's just an example. It's the same situation across the country. But there is a new power plant coming up 70 kilometers away from Delhi, aerial distance, Khurja, which is a public sector power plant, NTPC, NHPC, funded by PFC, and there is going to be at least 12,000 as per crores as per the initial cost, and it will increase by the time it's built, which means
we do have a shortage of time, Sunil. So please wind up really quickly, and then just a minute each for Tirthankar and Vigya.
So my concluding remark is that two things which government should do. One, we shouldn't try to walk both the paths of RE and coal at the same time. There needs to be a little bit more clarity rather than just directional aspect to it. Secondly, any new investment in coal, both in coal mining or the public sector coal-based power plants should stop. We have enough capacity, and if there is any investment to be made, it should be in renewable energy, battery storage, and grid infrastructure improvements. And that's what the governments can do better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tirthankar, 57 seconds.
Yeah, I think the thing is very clear. If you want to add 50 gigawatts of renewable energy per year, it has to be in terms of grid scale and DRE, because, and for those things, the investment terms has to be different. And for DRE, what you need to do is basically to include all those de-risking components has to be addressed by the government. And for grid scale, you have to have a scenario whereby your tariffs has to be addressed. Those are the two investment parts. And I think the other component, the other point which I made to, which I need to answer, incorporate is that investment is also, other component of investment is the dealings that you do on technologies, right? It is high time we talk about technology sales rather than technology transfer. That is a misnomer. Nobody transfer the technology. It's high time when we talk to the multinationals and everybody, let us consider it is a technology sale. That's a better way to actually negotiate. It's the government is in a better position to negotiate. That's it.
Thank you so much, Vigya. We need clarity. Technology sale is something I'm taking back. Your thoughts?
Can everybody see the map I'm sharing?
Yes, yes.
Collection of maps. I just wanted, I'll take 30 seconds. I just wanted to end with a couple of maps we created. It leads in back to the previous question as well about energy disparity. And I would particularly like to draw everybody's attention to this final map here, which overlays India's coal mines and energy transition minerals reserves and resources. A lot of it exists in areas that have, over the last 50 years, attracted a lot of conflict and economic turmoil, particularly around this particular belt in Eastern India. I just want the government to be mindful of and be a little bit more concerned about, where these projects, there's new mining projects interface with indigenous lands, community lands, forest landscapes, and maybe develop a more robust social and environmental sort of impact assessment protocols. Focus a bit more on planned closures and not have abandoned mines sitting around everywhere in the coal provinces. So I think from a policy perspective, better regulatory environment, if we have to go towards greater mining for energy transition minerals, is where I would like to see more action in the clean energy space.
Thank you. Extremely valid points. Mrityunjoy, over to you to try and wrap up this very, very interesting session.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I won't even attempt to bring together what has been an extremely rich discussion, as behoves a topic such as this, which brought forth very clearly the different views, the different lenses with which you can approach it. And each one of those lenses had very pertinent insights to offer. And as we go forward, as we craft a pathway that is sui generis for India, each of these things have to be addressed. So it was a very rich conversation, and I'm particularly glad that I was here and listening. So let me sort of bring it together in some ways with a few final thoughts, which tries to reflect some of this conversation. To begin with, the reality of climate change is upon us. There's just no way one can run away from it. Not only is it the case that India is in a particularly vulnerable position with climate change related events, it is also the case that if tomorrow average temperatures rise by 2 degrees, then India's vulnerability is at the top end. India, Brazil, Mexico are the economies that are going to be put particularly affected if average temperatures rise to 2. So it is in our own interest to see how much we can contribute to our own decarbonization, and in doing so, of course, we'll contribute to the global effort towards decarbonization. The closer we are at 1.5 is better for us. The further away we go, we have stored up more and more trouble. That said, let me also say that we stand at an inflection point. We stand at an inflection point in terms of growth, development, technology, technological change. And one must not run away from the fact that incorporating that inflection point into the analysis of pathways. So it is very true that in the past, electricity demand is overestimated. But it's equally true that we have to shift out of a service-driven growth strategy. If you're going to shift out of a service-driven growth strategy, if you're going to be manufacturing intensive, if you're going to be construction infrastructure intensive, your energy requirements of the past cannot reflect the energy requirements of the future. So that again is true. It's equally true that India remains in many ways an economy with a relatively high degree of poverty. So you cannot talk about reducing consumption per head. It's unethical to talk about reducing consumption per head. You have to talk about increasing consumption per head. You have to eliminate poverty. The economy has to grow at a minimum between 6 to 7% per annum and deliver all this. But you can't talk. You can't talk of reducing the per unit carbon emission, per unit of consumption, the per unit of investment, per unit of growth. And the answers to each of these three have all been delineated by the various speakers as they have brought forward these issues. Let me also say that because it's a point of inflection, it is also provides us an opportunity as an economy and as a society to correct some of the problems that our current model of growth faces. We don't invest enough in technology. We don't invest enough in R&D. Because we don't invest enough in technology and we don't invest in R&D, our non-oil current account deficit refuses to close. And if you're going to repeat the same thing with low carbon technology, then you have learned nothing. But if we can use that technology to increase value added domestically and become competitive globally, then it's created a new opportunity where increasing value added adds to increasing incomes and price competitiveness, lowest poverty, right? And the final point I in the last minute I want to highlight over here is something else that came up, which is perhaps if you look at India's last 70 years of growth in both economic and political terms, one of the most amazing things about this country is its ability to use its political institutions in a way in where it leverages cooperative federalism. It also goes through a way in which it leverages competitive federalism. In some areas, the decentralization doesn't work as well as it does in other areas. But the fact that decentralization is woven into the political process gives you the political mechanism with which to have the conversation which you need to have if you're going to make this transition more just and more efficient. With these few words, thank you very much for all of you for an excellent and outstanding discussion.
Thank you. Over to you, Deepak, to close the session.
Thank you very much. And this was a really insightful session. We had enthusiastic response to the webinar already. And we see that people have been here till the very end of the webinar. We have a host of 3 webinars coming up on this series, where we will be taking on different themes related to issues of coal transition. And we look forward to your participation. Thank you very much yet again.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Runa.
Thanks,
Thank you, Deepak.
everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, Mrityunjay. Nice to meet everybody. Bye.